So welcome if you are just joining us. My name is Chris Newport. I'm the head coach and a lead dietitian and exercise physiologist at the Endurance Edge. And we have a special guest today. This is Lee Welch. He is doing a running biomechanics presentation for us. He is one of the co-owners of Beyond Physical Therapy and the Running PTs. They're located in Cary and Apex, and we'll give you information on how to get a hold of both of us towards the end. But I know we got a lot to go into, so Lee, take it away.
Yeah, so this is a lecture on running biomechanics. Everybody is interested in biomechanics. It's an interesting topic. Running biomechanics is not necessarily the grail when it comes to running injuries, but it is very important. And I think when we say biomechanics, the key is understanding the science behind the run form. So a lot of people have heard, what things they should be practicing when they're running, and some of those things are true. But I think it's important as a runner. Runners are very educated, or a triathlete, they're very educated individuals oftentimes. And so education is key, and understanding why we're doing things helps make it a little bit more impactful and stick a little bit better. So let's see here.
And
so
while you're doing that, just FYI guys, we will check in on questions about every 10 minutes or so. So go for it. Good.
So this is I lecture at ECU and their running special topics class. I went to ECU for physical therapy school, and I like to show this slide anytime I do a lecture on running biomechanics. You'll see, I don't know if you guys can see it on the right, it says first do no harm. And I think that's really important when it comes to biomechanics, because you can really hurt somebody. A lot of run form that you would read about is based off of elite athletes that are running anywhere from a 4 to 5 minute pace oftentimes. So a lot of what you'll read, that is ideal form. And so if you're comparing a lot of us to those athletes, it'd be very hard for us to emulate that run form because we're not running that fast. So certain run form changes are safe, some are less safe. And I think it's important to know a little bit about that. I always say, just because you don't like the way something looks in a runner's form is not enough reason to change it. And a lot of times when you do make changes, if you see something wrong, sometimes making a run form change is just adding a compensation to a compensation. So it's not really fixing the problem. Sometimes run form changes or impairments can be indicative of problems in strength or mobility or something like that. So I always show this slide first because I do think it's important to consider that you can get hurt doing this if you're not careful. So what is running? Walking is defined as you have a double limb stance time. So you have a time where both feet are on the ground. About 40% of the time, both feet are on the ground when you're walking. When you're running, you never have 2 feet on the ground at the same time. So that's the definition of running. You achieve a flight phase. So it's essentially just a series of single leg hops. And in the research, runners are essentially defined as a spring. So these are the phases of running when it comes to biomechanics. Essentially, when we're doing a gait analysis, we're looking at every joint in every plane in every stance, or in every phase of gait. So there's 8 phases of gait. They all have their own importance when it comes to different injuries, different economical parameters. Probably the most important phases, and the ones we're going to hone in on today, are initial contact, loading response, and mid stance. So those first 3. A lot of the load that your body is absorbing is happening through initial contact to mid stance. So you can see that's when your foot hits the ground, all the way to loading response, which is where you start to absorb force, and then mid stance is when your foot is underneath you, underneath your center of mass. So we'll talk about those a little bit more, but I think it's important to understand there are a lot of phases of gait, and when we're doing an analysis, we're looking at every joint and every plane, and timing and those sorts of things are important too. So when we do a 3D analysis, which we do in research setting, we do those here. You're essentially getting. You can see this is transverse plane movement, which is spinning around the z-axis. A 3D analysis will give you motion in every joint in every plane. So this would just be an illustration of the hip, the knee, the ankle in the transverse plane. So when we're doing a 2D analysis and watching somebody run, we can estimate these movement patterns, and we know what normal is. So this is what a 3D analysis would look like. You've got the TV in the front with the runner running in real time. There's 35 markers that we put on the body from head to toe. And we have 12 cameras that are filming those retroreflective markers around the individual. And from that, I mean, it's fun to see, they're fun to do, but the important thing from this is the data that you get out of it and knowing how to use that. So some of the variables that we are manipulating with run form changes, this is kind of the science behind why this can be important and why run form changes can be impactful. I want you to think about your center of mass first. So your center of mass, I like to imagine that as like a softball in the middle of your pelvis. Okay, so if we defined all of us into one ball, your center of mass is right and probably in the middle of your pelvis. Okay, and then you have a ground reaction force vector. The ground reaction force vector, when you hit the ground pushes back against you, and it doesn't push straight up. If you hit the ground at an angle, it's going to push back at an angle. If you hit the ground straight up and down, it's going to push back straight up and down. So you have your center of mass and you have your ground reaction force vector. And in the lab, in the research setting, you can physically see that ground reaction force vector if you're running on a force plate. And so where that ground reaction force vector is oriented relative to your center of mass, and where the ground reaction force is coming relative to your center of mass, can create longer lever arms. So the further those are away from each other, the longer the lever arm is going to be, the more torque or force you'll have at a joint. So your joints and muscle, or your joints are all just levers. Muscles are just levers. So a shovel is a lever. If you imagine lifting, if we all have a shovel in our hand and we're lifting a brick on the end, and then all of a sudden we add 2 feet to that shovel and lift the same brick, it's going to be perceived to be a lot heavier because the lever arm is longer. So when it comes to some run form changes, really manipulating that center of mass and the ground reaction force is where you can really make a big impact on somebody. This next slide is an illustration of what that ground reaction force would look like graphed. So x-axis is time. So this is defined as stance phase. So this graph is from initial contact, which is the 0, to toe off, which is right at around 300 milliseconds. So, and then the y-axis is your ground reaction force. So the important things to note in ground reaction force are your peak ground reaction force. So that's when you're in mid stance. That's the highest point of this graph, when your foot is over or is under your body. And then you also have the rate of this ground reaction force. So that's defined as you can see it on the left-hand side, is the slope of the line. That's called your vertical loading rate. So there's some research that shows that running injuries, there's some research that predicts people not getting hurt, and those individuals have a lower peak load, and they also have a lower slope at which, so they absorb force a little bit slower. So this is kind of the science behind ground reaction force and why that's important. So
Lee, can I interject real quick?
Of course.
Can you go back to that last slide? So I know, and I'm sure a lot of other people are thinking, like, how do runners make that that impact a little lighter? Is that through shoes? Is that through truly changing your biomechanics? Or is it something that we're just built into, like that we just naturally do?
There was I think with intentionality in your form is the key. Shoes don't really change the load. They may just dampen it a little bit. There was a research study where all they did with individuals was they gave them the cue, run light, and that worked to lower the peak load. There was and some of it is intrinsic to the runner. There was a study where they looked at like 400 female runners, and there was a subset of female runners within that group that had never been hurt. And so they compared the non-injured group to all the other runners. And the only thing that was different was this graph. They had less loading rate and less peak load. And so that was just, and it's relative to body weight. It's not that they didn't hit the ground as hard. All these ground reaction force vectors are relative to your body weight. So you hit the ground with up to 3.5 times your body weight. What they found was the non-injured runners were only hitting the ground with, in some cases, like 1.5 body weights. So the less force you have to absorb, the less likely you are to get hurt in most cases.
Okay, cool.
So that's a good question. So this is a slide that I give a lot of times. We're only going to go into these highlighted ones today. So important principles behind running mechanics. They're somewhat individualized. Good cadence and stride length and posture. We'll read the other ones. Maximize your stride angle, minimize your overstride angle. Your stride angle is the angle between your femurs at maximum separation. Maintaining pelvic
thigh bones for those of us who don't know our bones.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, maximizing the angle between your thigh bones is a good predictor of economy, and it can help with run form changes. Or it can help with your run form to change that. But that's one of those ones you'd want to be careful with. Maintaining pelvic stability, so that's just how good you control your hips. Controlling pronation. Pronation is a good thing. Pronation is how you absorb shock, but too much pronation can increase injury risk, especially if it's happening really early. Minimizing bounding, and then symmetry. Symmetry should be relative. If somebody is asymmetrical on the table, then I would expect their run form to be asymmetrical, and that's fine. But you don't want to get sloppy with it and let one side, hang out at end range pronation and the other side not. So anyway, but again, we're going to mainly be talking about cadence, stride length, and posture today, and why that's important. So what is goal form? So like I said before, a lot of goal form is taken from elite runners. The average half marathon pace is somewhere around 11 minutes a mile for females. So that's not a 4-minute mile. So I wouldn't expect an 11-minute miler to look like a 4-minute miler. It's just not realistic. And so if you're taking these principles and forcing them on people that are running an 11-minute mile, it's not going to work. And you're going to probably make them a little less economical in the process. But what is goal form when we're looking at elite runners? Because I think some of these things we can apply. You can see that these runners all have very aggressive lean. That's posture. The front leg, you can see in all of these individuals, their shin is not extended past their knee. And when they hit the ground, they approach the ground close to their center of mass, and their shin is relatively vertical at initial contact. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So normal versus abnormal gait. So when we call abnormal gait deviations from these individuals are normal. Some deviations are going to be normal. Some are expected off of body type. Some are expected off of pace. So when you take somebody that's walking, they're going to land with their knee extended, not with their knee bent underneath them. So if you take somebody that's running a 14-minute mile, I would expect them to let their knee come into a little extension. We would refer to that as overstriding. In some of those cases, that can be okay. So we won't get too much into that, but that plays into kind of what I'm getting ready to talk about. So this is a slide of a bunch of different runners. We have Olympians on the left-hand side and you and I on the right-hand side. So you can see there's a lot of variations and variability. I could predict which of these runners is probably flexible, which one of these runners is probably tight based off of the way they move. And if they're really flexible, I would expect them to move a certain way, even among an elite level. But I also see things in some of these runners that they could potentially improve. But the point is we're all different. We're all built different. We're created different. So you should see variability in run form when it comes to endurance running. So center of mass relative to ground contact. So this is what we talked about earlier. So imagine this one on the left is this picture on the left, this line in my pelvis is around where my center of mass would be. If we drop a plumb line straight down from that, and then carry that over to my initial contact point, that's a lever arm. So you can see the lever arm on the left is longer than the lever arm on the right. So what is the difference between these two? Well, the difference between these two, I intentionally, in both of these pictures, I was striking on my rear foot. The difference is my knee. The difference is not my foot. The difference is that at initial contact on this left one, my knee is extended. At initial contact on the right side, my knee is bent. So this is actually not initial contact on the right. This is loading response. But we would refer to this one on the left as overstriding because you're landing out in front of your center of mass. Some people would call this a heel strike. I would tend to call this overstriding. I'm not looking at the foot in this case. I see what everybody sees, that I'm landing on my heel. But what's more important is the fact that I'm landing with my knee in extension. Okay, and the reason is that that increases this lever arm significantly, so it increases torque and force at the hip and the knee. So how do you reduce? So this is not good, right? This one on the left is not good. I would agree with that, but it's not because I'm landing on my heel. It's because my knee is extended and there's this long lever arm. So again, use that shovel analogy. There's a lot more force that I have to absorb, and this also increases the vertical ground reaction force vector to land like this. So how do you reduce overstriding? Well, one way is to reduce the overstride angle, or the inclination angle. So the overstride angle would be the angle between your shin and the lab, so vertical. So this angle of your shin and the lab. Your inclination angle is your foot relative to the floor. So on the left, 32-degree angle of inclination. On the right, 7-degree approximately angle of inclination. So you can see we would call this on the left a heel strike. That's what people call this. These are both technically going to be rear foot strike patterns, but the one on the right, the knee is bent. So one way you can reduce overstriding is by intentionally landing with your foot a little bit flatter, so not toed up as much. In this slide, you'll see a lot of people will start with foot strike when they're trying to reduce overstriding. So left slide, forefoot strike. Second slide is a midfoot strike, or as close as Aaron could get to this. Third slide is a rear foot strike. Fourth slide is a rear foot strike. So we have rear foot. So you can see the first three slides are, if you don't look at the foot, they're basically identical. So forefoot strike, midfoot strike, rear foot strike does not matter. This one on the right is also a rear foot strike, but the difference is that the knee is extended. So that's what's important. It's not rear foot, midfoot, forefoot strike. Now, this gets cued a lot, and I will use this at times to have somebody land on the ball of their foot. But the reason, because it's the easiest way to get you to land underneath your knee. But it's a little sloppy to do that with everybody, and there's research behind why that's sloppy and why that may increase your injury risk a little bit. So take home from here is that foot strike is really secondary to some of the more important things that are happening up top. So I'm going to move this over. What's the research show on foot strike? So foot strike pattern, these are based off of research studies. Foot strike pattern, rear, mid, forefoot strike should be secondary to all other factors, and runners should understand that changing foot strike pattern can negatively impact metabolic consumption and efficiency, and it can increase your injury risk in certain areas. Injury location with a forefoot strike is more, you're going to load. So let me step back. Distal injuries, so injuries in the foot and ankle, we think are a little more common with a fore or midfoot strike pattern. Proximal injuries, knee, hip, and ankle are a little bit more common with a rear foot strike pattern. So there's certainly times that you may want to change foot strike pattern. For example, 55-year-old, 200-pound male with bilateral knee pain and a little bit of arthritis. That's an individual you would want to change to a forefoot strike in some cases, because you're really going to offload the knee. When you run with a forefoot strike, you put 47.7 more body weights per mile through your calf and Achilles. 47.7. So you rob Peter, you pay Paul, essentially is what I say. But interestingly, the most common thing I use this example of the 50-year-old male runner or triathlete, the most common thing I see clinically in that demographic are calf strains, not knee pain. I see a lot of calf strains in this demographic because the calves get significantly weaker with age. So you have to be careful with these form changes. And if I make those, I educate the individuals that I see a lot of calf strains. So let's be careful transitioning you to a mid or forefoot strike. And there's other ways that you can offload the knees, like cadence, stride length. And I would probably start with those.
So we see a lot of people, seeing that we do metabolic testing and sweat testing here, who oftentimes cramp in their calves, and they're coming to us because they think it's a electrolyte imbalance, and oftentimes it is, but I feel like it's, and you're supporting this here, is that it's oftentimes form. It's their biomechanics that is over engaging that calf and making it, in other words, sort of freak out a little bit, right?
Yeah, particularly in men, I would say that. And well, and on the flip side, I see a lot of runners with calf cramps that it's clear to me after the evaluation that it is not musculoskeletal, that it's an electrolyte kind of thing. And those are, that's kind of where you have to trust somebody's judgment, like me or Chris. But but yeah, that I would agree with that. A lot of times it is mechanical. We know that in men, the research shows that they start to use their calves significantly more as they get older, and their calves get significantly weaker as they get older. So that by itself increases the injury risk. And then you take somebody and you transition them haphazardly to a forefoot strike, and it's a recipe for a calf strain. Particularly if you change them to a forefoot strike and drop them down to a really low drop shoe really quickly, you got to have a good reason to do that. And that, I see that a lot because it works. It offloads the knees, but you significantly loaded the calves and they may not be prepared. So what's the take home behind that? So you want to focus first on changing ground reaction force, not necessarily foot strike. So a really recent research study, they concluded that based on examining the research literature, that changing to a mid or forefoot strike does not improve running economy. It does not eliminate an impact at the foot ground contact, and it does not reduce the risk of running related injuries. We think that there's a transition point around a 6-minute mile where a midfoot strike starts to become more metabolically efficient for some people. But we don't know that for sure because everybody's different. A lot of professional marathoners technically run with a rear foot strike, but it'd be more like this picture right here, this third one. So they've got good mechanics up top, but the heel is just the first thing that happens to hit the ground. Let's see. So another way to manipulate your center of mass is through posture. So this is very important. Your posture is very important when it comes to your center of mass, and we'll talk about why. So some of the common postural running habits that I see, these are just 3. We have leaning back. A lot of men will do this. A lot of faster runners will do this. And I personally think this is because they get fatigued and they start to take advantage. When you lean back like that, it puts a little stretch on your hip flexor and helps you pull that leg through. So it'd be like me sitting in the chair. When I sit for 2 or 3 hours, I like to slouch because it's easier. So a lot of postural running habits that we see in men, a lot of times we see leaning back. In women, a lot of times we see sitting back. So sitting back is almost like squatting a little bit. Females are quad dominant and they tend to be a lot more flexible than men. And so squatting or sitting back allows them to take advantage of the quad strength. That's my theory behind that. It's definitely, I see these trends in runners. And then we've got on the right, we're not gonna talk about this today, but we've got pelvic drop is another postural habit that we see. So why does posture matter? Well, it goes back to your center of mass. So this is the same runner. You can look at the foot, the shin, the knee flexion on both sides. It's very similar, but up top, you can see her chest is really back on the left picture, and she's leaning a little bit on the right picture. So what that does when she's bringing her center of mass forward. And if you drop a plumb line from the center of mass and compare that to her contact point, you can see the lever arm is shorter when her center of mass is closer to her foot. So that's the science behind why posture and initial contact position matter. So when you're changing when you're trying to change these variables, cadence is always the safest place to start. Cadence is defined as how many steps you take in a minute. It's also your stride length. So you can increase cadence by decreasing your stride length. Just think shorter, quicker steps. There's been some research that shows that increasing run cadence by 10% can reduce stress through the lower extremity. And increasing cadence by 5% offloads the knee by 10%, the patellofemoral joint. It's a very famous study. 180 is not the magic number. You will read that. A lot of people know this number. This comes from a research study years back where they found that there wasn't a race that had been won with a cadence lower than 180. But if you take a 6'6" ultra marathoner and a 5'2" half marathoner, you would expect that their cadence is going to be different. And your cadence should change during your workouts as well. The faster you run, the faster you're going to take steps. So I like to see around, it depends on the individual, but I like to see anywhere from 165 to 175 is pretty safe. If you're in the 150s, a lot of times that's a little low, but it depends on pace. I've certainly seen times where that somebody's had 150 and I haven't changed it. But so take homes, we're all different in individuals. And for some people, there's also research that shows that increasing cadence past their preferred cadence is detrimental to economy. So there's a trade-off in a lot of cases between economy and injury. I would always argue higher cadence is better for injury. I've never seen higher cadence hurt somebody, but higher cadence may reduce your economy or your metabolic efficiency a little bit. There's some research that shows that. So it's a little conflicting research when it comes to that. But my mentor, Blaze Williams, who's now at Nike, he used to always say, the best way to not get hurt is to not run very much, run slow, and run with a really high cadence. So if you do those things, you won't get hurt. But as athletes, we're really trying to maximize that relationship between economy and injury rate. So this is one of those places where 5-10% is usually safe and not detrimental to your economy. But if you've ever tried to run, if you're a 172 cadence person and you've tried to run at 180, the reason you're continually bumping back down is because you're more efficient down there at 172. You may be a little less injury risk at 180, but there's a trade-off. And so finding that balance is important. So why does cadence work? I'll try to wrap this up quick, but this is a visual illustration. So again, this graph on the left, this is one step. You got ground reaction force on the y-axis and time on the x. So you absorb force every time you hit the ground. This graph, you have two graphs over on the right of multiple steps in a row. So the top one would be an illustration, let's say, of somebody with a cadence of 155. The bottom one with a cadence of 165. So you can see there's more frequent steps, but when you increase your cadence, you decrease this ground reaction force peak. So let's say you have a cadence of 155, you're hitting the ground with 2.5 body weights. 165 is 2 body weights. Now these are just made up numbers. If you put that into a ratio, you've got 387.5 body weights per minute with a cadence of 155 and 330 body weights per minute with a cadence of 165. So that is why it works. Not only is it decreasing ground reaction force, it's shortening your stride length. So you're putting your center of mass and your ground reaction force a little closer together. So it's pretty simple, but that's a good illustration of why cadence decreasing stride length may work. So what are some safe strategies that you can try today? Efficient, quick steps, increase cadence, decrease stride length. If you haven't done that before, it's safe to do that. If you've done that already, it doesn't mean you should necessarily go higher. You want to try to land underneath your body with your knee slightly bent. Now, realistically, you're not going to land right underneath your body. Overstriding is defined as landing too far in front of your body. We should all land a little bit in front of our center of mass. That allows you to take advantage of something called elastic recoil. You have to load that spring so you can unload the spring. So you should land a little bit in front of your body. It doesn't have to be straight underneath. Good posture is important if you haven't thought about that. Like I use the analogy of sitting. When I sit, I like to do this because it's easier. So when people run, they like to fall into their postural habits. Like me, I like to lean back. A lot of females like to sit back. It's because it's easier, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. We all know that this is not good for our necks when we're working. So I think run form posture should be no different. There's some research that shows that maintaining arm swing is good for metabolic efficiency. So I always throw that in there. And then I take it back to that run light study. So relaxed, effortless form, thinking run light, those kind of intentional cues can help. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Lee, I know I've seen your 3D analysis in the flesh. It's pretty amazing. You do an analysis on people on the table, like you had referred to earlier, but it's not like you're just throwing them on the treadmill and looking at them run. You're actually looking at their mobility beforehand.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of value in that. And then you sit down with them for an hour afterwards, not directly afterwards, but after you get the report together. So I think that's fantastic. So how can people contact you if they want either a 2D analysis or 3D analysis, or even just to get in with you and get a PT session?
Yeah, the majority of my Cadence analyses are done through insurance on an injured runner on the treadmill. They come in and they're hurt, and if you've got a running injury, I'm going to watch you run. But if you want to get in contact with me, you can call our number. Our office is 919-803-3398, or on our website, therunningpts.com. We have a web inquiry form that a lot of people use. You can just fill out that form online and somebody will contact you pretty quickly. So those are probably the easiest ways.
Awesome. So I will follow up with everybody who's in the webinar currently with that information. So you guys have Lee's info. Are you okay with sharing like a PDF of your slides with them too?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, awesome. All right. So I'll put that together. Lee, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative and enlightening. I think I'm kind of thinking through the typical stuff that runners ask me, and you definitely nailed them all on the head. So fantastic. So again, this is Lee Welch from the Running PTs, and it's therunningpts.com. If you guys need anything from us, we are at theenduranceedge.com. And thank you again, Lee. That's great.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I appreciate your help and your opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks.